Thanks a lot and welcome everybody to our April version, to the first one of our cluster meeting today with Calliope Spanou, talking about, I assume, not only her research, but also her own experience in the field. So Calliope is professor of administrative sciences at the National and Kapodistrian University of Athens. She has a focus on public policy, public administration, and administrative science. But recently, and that's also was the focus of your work when you were here at the Schumann Center last year as a fellow on evidence-informed policymaking and aspects of expertise. And Calliope, your work is not only nurtured by your research, by your own work as a professor, but by your various engagements in politics. And they span from being a caretaker Minister of the Interior for a short span in 23, over the big period, the decade that you were deputy and then ombudswoman of Greece, but also engagement as advisor of the Ministry for the Interior, various committee members for public administration reform, and also advisor of studies for the National Center of Public Administration. So apart from that, obviously, you have the plethora of academic engagements in Germany, France, at the Robert Schumann Center for the OECD, the LSE, and Oxford University. And today you will speak about your recent work on the scientisation of policy and the visibility of science and scientific expertise in policymaking, and what that does and how it relates to democratic governance. So, meaning we will look today into the impact of science visibility, expertise, visibility of expertise in policymaking, how this impacts or not in terms of depoliticization or re-politicization, questions of accountability, transparency, and legitimacy in policymaking. It's an ongoing work that you're presenting, so we're in the Q&A session. Very happy for all of the participants who are highly welcome to join and to really discuss it as a work in progress. Calliope, I'm very happy to discuss your work today with a bigger group, and I hand over to you. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you very much, Gabi, and I thank very much all the team that made this seminar possible in many ways. Thank everybody for being today here. I look forward to the discussion that breaks the isolation in which we often work as academics. Just a few introductory remarks. This presentation is part of a broader project on on scientific knowledge in public administration and public policy. But today I will focus on this specific subject, which is the visibility of scientific expertise. Now, I will start by what triggered my interest in today's subject. Particularly during the pandemic, there appeared a renewed interest in scientific knowledge as part of policy making. It's a phenomenon that has been named policy scientisation. The term has come a few decades ago, but we talk about it again in today's conditions. The pandemic highlighted the role of scientific expertise as a component of good or democratic governance, but also revived democratic concerns about the expertization of policy decisions and also sometimes attacks on science. So it is a very actual subject, something we are discussing from various points of view. Today, this is a more specific one. In my approach to the subject combines two related points, focal points, I would say. First, a new emerging feature, the visibility of scientific expertise. By that, I refer to a practice of conspicuous use of scientific expertise, which marks its exit from the backstage of politics. So scientific knowledge and expertise are not only used to feed the substance of decisions, but expertise as well as expert bodies, experts are placed in the spotlight as part of regular decision making. And this in certain policy areas. We should not take that as a general practice. There are certain policy areas which are not in some way affected by that. We can easily think of some, but definitely there have to be certain characteristics also that make these policy areas more open to such practice. In this context, a new push was given also to the movement of evidence-informed policymaking that was on the rise since the 90s, particularly at the time of Prime Minister Blair, which now appears as having a new perspective, taking a new perspective. Now, the second point, apart from the visibility, is that this visibility is presented as a form of open government, transparency, accountability, with a claim to enhance democracy and good governance. So today I will discuss this new feature and its implications for democratic governance. Before going further, a short clarification is needed on the terms of democracy and good governance. They are often used as synonyms, but their history and their center of gravity are different. I leave aside the discussion for now. We can come back to that later on. But I need to clarify that good governance or democratic governance here refer to procedural legitimacy, such as transparency and accountability, which are then supposed to enhance democracy, an association that I tend to question. A starting question is how to conceptualize visibility. What is visibility? Usually the term is used in various disciplines, often in a descriptive way. It refers to what can be seen, what is perceptible by the sense of sight, as opposed to the invisible, which cannot be seen, is imperceptible or hidden from you. In that context, it also means exposure of a person, an issue, a situation, a claim, an institution, a policy, etc., to a broader public, and it is associated to publicity in the public space. Hence, it is logically connected to the media and communication process. But beyond that, more conceptual elaborations attached to it further functions. It is defined as a relational concept, which, among other, denotes a positive or negative exemplarity. That is, it exposes what may be portrayed as a desirable situation, state, or the opposite, and attributes credit and discredit, praise or shame. It is also associated to knowledge, recognition, and control as a dimension of power and powerlessness in the intellectual tradition of Foucault. Visibility may exist also at different degrees. It is used often in the context of under visibility, super visibility, over or exaggerated visibility, with distinct effects on the relationship and the power dynamics it shapes. This is where the discussion turns to the politics of visibility, often used in the case of absence of visibility, referring to the powerlessness of minority or underrepresented groups to bring their issues of concern to the political agenda or to legitimize their presence and claims. The opposite is in contrast associated with their empowerment. Another aspect of visibility linked to power refers to making legible, for example, through science, statistics. In this case, for example, de Rosier has shown the role of statistical instruments that make society legible to the state and therefore enhances its capacity of intervention and contributes to the rationalization of the means of action of the state. Or we have Scott's work on the legibility of society as providing the capacity to the state for large-scale engineering, social engineering. And of course, in the tradition of Foucault, the idea of governmentality, this visibility serves social control and is part of governance and domination, as we find in surveillance studies, disciplinary society, and the like. Now, the politics of visibility show that visibility is a political tool, and as such, it can be used, managed, and manipulated. Beyond the physical, let's say, component of sight, it also contains an important symbolic potential, which allows it to be exactly managed and manipulated. On this slide, I have put a short citation by Briganti, who is among the first to elaborate on this concept, to make it a concept, if you like, a sociological category, as he says, where he combines the relations of perception and the relations of power. And between the two is the symbolic, which links them. So in that sense, I see visibility as a strategy with the following defining elements. First, we have at least two sides, an actor, a target population or audience, and their relationship, which can be reshaped or tends to be reshaped through this visibility. A process of interaction which guides attention in a selective way as a focusing instrument in order to shape perceptions. And this is meant to produce beneficial effects for the actor who controls it. And have beneficial effects to the claims, issues, or the actor as such, and the message they intend to convey. As a strategy, so visibility can be managed by both sides of the power relation, and this leads to either consolidate it or challenge it. So it doesn't say what is, ex ante its result. It can be used by both sides, and the relationship can be consolidated or challenged. If we take now this concept into the context of public policy, we can have two sub-sides, let's say, or two ways to approach it. The visibility for public policy, which refers to issue prioritization, agenda setting, or the politics of attention. That means how groups mobilize to gain public and media attention and support. And there the focus is on an issue, a target group, a situation, which may or may not be problematized as a policy objective, as a policy problem. The second is visibility of public policy, and here we have a focus on the policy as such, its content, its processual characteristics, and with that we mean participation, transparency, but also the input of scientific expertise, which is in fact part of this policy making process. The visibility may, in fact, indicate an actual or a symbolic response to the presumed expectations of the public. A usual example is if policing, for example, is highly visible or has low visibility. But in this case, we have expertise, which is an internal characteristic of the or internal component of the policy-making process. In this case, it responds to the presumed appreciation by the audience of the contributions of science to public decision making. So the expectation, let's say, that is assumed is that the public holds in high esteem science and scientific knowledge, and therefore by making its contribution to policy making visible, then it gains in a way in acceptance, in legitimacy, or the rest. What is the objective is, as we already said, is to shape the perception of specific issues, problems, processes, and also the conditions of policy making and policy implementation by promoting this scientific contribution. But invisibility also interacts with other policy features, such as issue salience and complexity, and it can have an effect on the depoliticization or re-politicization of an issue. For example, issue complexity limits visibility. It favors scientific expertise and tends to restrict citizen participation. There we would expect depoliticization. But issue salience may encourage a strategy of visibility, which in turn enhances salience. And when visibility of scientific knowledge amplifies salience, it encourages also open discussion and therefore re-politicizes the policy issue. But not only the policy issue, also the scientific expertise around it. And an example for it is the pandemic and the use of the scientific expertise in managing the pandemic. Pandemic was a high science and high proximity issue. Everybody was interested, affected. It was an urgent issue. There was a lot of uncertainty around it. And that feature not only encouraged the utilization of scientific knowledge, but also the open reference to science and scientific knowledge as part of policy decisions. The visibility strategy meant to convey signals of rationality and legitimacy in policymaking. But at the same time, it encouraged the discussion, not to say the controversy around the issue, and the scientific expertise that was used in these policies, vaccinations, social distancing, etc., which produced this re-politicization effect for a highly complex scientific issue. Though not only scientific, I have to say. We can also talk about that later. Now, raising the issue of the visibility of scientific expertise leads to the distinction between formal authority and informal influence in policymaking. Here we can refer to the distinction introduced, among other, by Kingdon between the visible, institutional, and invisible or hidden actors in policymaking. An institutional actor is visible, but that does not mean full visibility, because the very term of transparency, which is usually used for this, points to a selection of aspects and processes that are made visible or remain in the shade, sometimes also for legitimate reasons. Those who contribute their specialized knowledge mostly remain invisible. They maintain a low profile despite potential. They have a lesser institutional standing than policymakers, decision makers, and therefore they remain in the backstage, their contribution not visible and maybe even informal. This corresponds to the institutional division of labor in a democracy that implies that politicians control the necessary resources to make decisions, among other the expert resources, and any attempt from their side to high point the invisible partners, in that case scientists and expert bodies, is understood as shifting the responsibility and the blame. So it is suspected as attempting to evade their ultimate responsibility. This is the institutional architecture of democracy, and this is why experts most of the time have remained behind the scenes. So what we can say is that the strategy of visibility of the scientific expertise is at odds with the informal role of scientific experts and expertise. And this is also what has been a point of interest for me. A few words about media type visibility, because I mean we cannot talk about visibility without the intervention of the media. In modern society, accounts of scientific knowledge transit more or less covered by the media, through the media. They are covered by the media. And this has been qualified as medialization or mediatization of science, mass-mediated scientific expertise. But this mediation is not without consequences, because the media do not only transfer knowledge to a wider public, but they construct their own reality. They have their own selection criteria and highlight selectively specific aspects. Another consequence is that increased media visibility creates more vulnerability. It generates more interest from the media, and it cannot be completely controlled. And more generally, mediatization, together with politicization and commercialization of science, as Weingart has established, contribute to a loss of distance between science and society as the most important basis for the production of reliable knowledge. So that is, let's say, why the result of this medialization of science. But apart from this, we have also some consequence for policy making, more specifically. First of all, the media appear as a relevant context for political decision making and as an indirect route of policy advice or informal policy advice. Suddenly, the media play a role in policy making. It could be indirect, but still a role. It is underlined that this public knowledge limits the autonomy of politics to control the definition of the issue, and the knowledge domains from which advice is drawn. The political decision making needs to respond, to react in some way to what appears in the media as scientific expertise and knowledge. Another issue is that it creates competition with the formal system of policy advice and expertise, and encourages political competition on the policy debate, but includes also the scientific expertise that is used in policymaking. The media also tends to distort scientific controversies through simplification and polarization of the issues, and may also create confusion between scientific controversies and the arguments and value preferences that have to do with public policy. So on one side, scientific views, sometimes even uncertain or still in internal discussion. But on the other hand, we have issues of public policy which are more based on value preferences and arguments than on this scientific knowledge. So we have a confusion between these two aspects. Now, to sum up this first part, the visibility of scientific expertise brings to the fore the invisible actors and tends to re-politicize not only policy issues, but also the scientific expertise around them. It enlarges the forum of debate on complex scientific issues, increasing science, and potentially distorts and feeds scientific and policy controversies, which are not readily comprehensible to a non-scientific audience. It tends to create a confusion as to what is scientific and what is the policy problem at hand within non-scientific audiences. Now, the main challenge, in my view, and I think that will be an issue for our discussion, is the absence of a forum where these debates and controversies can be convened in a rational deliberation. So the confusion that results from this situation between scientific and policy issues tends to transfer contestation to science itself and potentially undermine its credibility. I'll come to the second part of this presentation, and the second question that I would like to develop is, now we examine the claim that visibility serves openness, transparency, and accountability, and hence democracy. The association of scientific knowledge to good and democratic governance needs to be seen in the context of diminishing political legitimacy and trust in political institutions. Visibility in this context is meant to suggest openness, transparency, and accountability for a political system that mostly operates in ways less understandable to the people. Such an example is provided by the European Commission's white paper on the reform of European governance of 2001. In this document, the Commission addresses the concern to boost confidence, openness, through openness, accountability, and responsibility. The document starts with the observation that the EU is losing confidence in a poorly understood and complex system to deliver the policies that the people want. Public perceptions are not held by the opacity of the Union's system of expert committees or the lack of information about how they work. It therefore considers the need for greater openness, accountability, and responsibility for all those involved to boost confidence in the way expert advice influences policy decisions. In order to achieve that, it recommends publishing guidelines on collection and use of expert advice so that it is clear what advice is given, where it is coming from, how it is used, and what alternative views are available. So there we have an early example of such an effort to make the internal workings related to the scientific expertise available to an outside public. So the visibility of scientific expertise can be understood as a conspicuous consumption of information. This is a phrase, an expression used by Feldman and Match. And it means that it is used as signal and symbol of commitment to rational choice, of personal and organizational competence, and as an implicit measure of the quality of the decision and further of governance. The objective is to increase procedural legitimacy, which is a dimension of the quality of governance. We can also see an effort to create conditions of an ex-ante legitimacy by projecting this positive exemplarity and transfer legitimacy from science to policy and politics. Now, transparency, accountability, openness are meant to shed light on these internal workings of the policy process. Such an undertaking, it is based, as we said, on the assumption that the utilization of specific or scientific expertise has a significant importance of the policy for the policy audience, particularly for policies which are highly salient and complex, and where uncertainty is considerable. Now, in order to examine the claim that visibility enhances democratic governance, we focus on the idea that it increases transparency and accountability. And given the partly overlapping ground between the concepts of visibility and transparency, we can borrow some elements of the existing rich discussion of the concepts of transparency and accountability and their relationship. First, does visibility equals transparency? Transparency is defined as a form of visibility management. Its characteristics and implications may vary. For example, it may be transparency in retrospect or real-time, the fishbowl transparency, as it is called. It may refer to process or substance, that is, to the grounds of a decision, the data used, etc. It can focus on the process, and then it can be the procedural aspect, which means the rules, or operational aspects, which means how these rules are applied. Now, the differences between transparency and visibility have to do with the institutional provision, the operationalization, and the legally binding character of transparency. Transparency is considered as the right to know. It is a means of empowerment and an effort to limit the scope of freedom of political decision makers. Among the various ways of categorizing transparency, there is also this distinction between passive or demand-driven and proactive or active or proactive transparency. And this latter one refers to the dissemination on the initiative of the government of information about its activities and the internal workings, as we have said already, as is in the case of scientific expertise. Now, the next question is if transparency leads to accountability. Accountability is generally understood as the obligation of an actor to explain and justify to a forum his or her conduct. The forum can ask questions and judge, and the actor may face consequences. Usually, transparency is seen as a precondition for accountability, but they may partly overlap. For example, accountability is often operationalized as transparency, which makes the decision-making process and the information used visible to outsiders and therefore contestable. Governments may present proactive transparency as a form of accountability. The critical difference is, again, the lack of the element of sanction. There is a lot more to the discussion on the relation of transparency to accountability. The least to say is that the relationship is not straightforward. It is observed that the process leading from one to the other is unclear. Transparency may be used as a sanction in itself, for example, for public shaming or faming. Accountability could then be reduced to providing information, and even transparency may diminish the need for formal accountability mechanisms instead of supporting them. I found very eloquent this table, which is proposed by Fox, but the two phases of transparency, two phases of accountability. It shows the partly overlapping character, but it also shows that one does not necessarily lead to the other. Transparency can be dissemination of information, but then the question is if there is institutional answerability and if this then leads to sanctions or other kind of compensation. So from information to answerability and sanctions, the path is quite long. Now, if we now transfer these observations to visibility as a form, let's say, of proactive transparency, we can see that it has a rather limited value for accountability. We will further discuss this conclusion under the title of limitations of visibility. We can divide in three points. The technical use of government practice, the capacity of the receivers of information to process and use it, and the dysfunctions and potential perverse effects. The tactical use. Now, this is linked to the performative character of visibility in the sense of constructing reality. Other authors describe in a similar way this high ambiguity of transparency. For example, they say it means both seen into something and seen through something. They may also talk about the transparency paradox, or its nature as a kaleidoscope in the sense of its potential for manipulation through selectivity and framing. It can then be a means also to deflect criticism and shift the blame for failures, inefficiencies, etc. Governments can use this transparency as a form of managed visibility, as a form of defensive risk management, to avoid or transfer liability and risk to others. Or they can do it in order to kill stories that could be portrayed as concealing information. But in our case, Vice has summarized it. She has worked a lot on the input of scientific knowledge in policymaking, that governments may try to avoid responsibility for unpopular policy outcomes by claiming that their actions were based on the recommendation of science. The second point is the capacity and expertise of the receivers, and there the question is whether the availability of information comes also with the capacity of assessment of this information. The capacity for assessment is in low supply, particularly for complex scientific issues. The availability of information, of knowledge about the scientific expertise may enhance trust, but on the condition that the audience has the relevant expertise. Otherwise, there might be confusion. Alternatively, if there is no such capacity, the general audience can only rely on a second-order judgment. That means specialized intermediaries can present in a simplified way and explain. But in that case, there is a question of dependency on these intermediaries and the agenda, their own agenda, which cannot be excluded. The intermediaries may be from journalists and reporters, environmental advocates, financial analysts, also the so-called visible scientists, people who like or are ready to appear in the media and play this role. And the media play also very much with them. A final reservation underlies the potential positive functions of limited or even lack of transparency in policymaking. That appears as the most radical reservation, let's say. For example, it is necessary in policymaking to have space in order to balance various aspects and options and or to handle negotiations for conflict resolution, etc. So this is the breathing space of policymaking. And the other issue that is raised is that when transparency has to do with the operational aspects, it can affect the behavior in ways that cannot be predicted, in the sense that the interaction with the outside audience starts at a moment when the policy is still not shaped. So it can influence the way it will be shaped, and maybe not for good, not for, to the benefit of the people. Sorry. The third point is the dysfunctions and unintended consequences. Now, when the audience lacks the capacity to process and assess information, as is the case often in matters of scientific knowledge, there might be panics, frustration, confusion, uncertainty, cynicism, and at the end of the day, eroding trust. It can also lead to misinformation and a culture of suspicion. When we have even more scientific controversies around these issues, this exposure tends to rather exacerbate the controversies. As Jasonov noted, parties will tend to deconstruct each other's position instead of deliberating effectively. And further, scientific knowledge can be challenged on political grounds. Once again, this confusion. In essence, it seems that rather than the wider audience, transparency can benefit expert outsiders rather than the general public. But these expert outsiders may use it according to their own agenda. And to conclude, the visibility of scientific knowledge in policy development is a government strategy, as we said, serving various objectives. But these objectives are only remotely linked to rational decision-making as much as to democratic governance. Furthermore, instead of reinforcing trust and depoliticizing policy issues and choices, it tends to re-politicize them and feed contestation within a forum unprepared for rational argumentation on scientific issues. It often produces a misperception of the respective roles, the formal responsibility of political decision makers, and the informal influence of scientific expertise. To put it differently, it produces a confusion between values associated with policy options and arguments based on even conflicting or uncertain scientific views and assessments. Placing scientific knowledge in the limelight does not necessarily increase legitimacy and trust in government. It may even undermine trust in science. Thank you for your patience.
Great, thank you very much, Calliope. Mic is open for everybody who wants to ask questions on this really very interesting elaboration on what we actually take for granted in a way. Right? When we talk about transparency, accountability, visibility, that would always in our mind be yes, 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 of course answers, right? Science use in policymaking does increase all of that, and there's a certain functional mechanism that flow from visibility towards democratic decision making. I have two participants on the list to come first, and then, if time allows, I have made some four comments that I would like us to discuss, because I think it's really a tremendously important and interesting subject that you're analyzing, Calliope. Anna, do you want to go first, please?
Sorry, now? Can you hear me?
Yes, now you're there.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Professor. A really fascinating topic. And actually, one of the earliest comments that you mentioned, you also mentioned the science, or let's say the scientific aspect behind COVID. And actually, last year, I also had the opportunity to present a paper that I co-authored with another PhD candidate, of the Graduate Institute in Geneva, about precisely the misuses of scientific language, the public health policies and human rights derogation during COVID-19. Because in WHO, so you have the legal framework that is the international health regulations, but also we analyze this topic vis-a-vis the Council of Europe system. So of course, COVID was a really uncertain. Nobody knew about what is happening, not even the scientific community. So then there was this lack of information, even the, let's say, the people that are supposed to have the knowledge. They don't know about this. But anyways, the countries that were taking measures, so policy side. So I really enjoy your presentation, because I see this part echo in some of your comments. And actually, I was wondering, because I was maybe thinking that you will develop more this case study of WHO and the, let's say, the inputs of the epistemology of scientific background of WHO doctors, but beyond the medical community, but also how this despite the fact that there were not certainty about what is COVID, what's happening, there were some measures put in place by the governments. But then you also mentioned about the infodemics. So it was also the misinformation. So also the media was really important in this sense during COVID. But also you mentioned that some people, I think one of your latest slides, you were mentioning that there were two, let's say, two options or two situations when the people that received information, they know how to digest, let's say, this information, or when there is another person that can, let's say, translate the scientific information into plain language, let's say. But then in this sense, there was also this problem because the population didn't know who to trust, and there were a lot of vaccine hesitancy. People were rejecting the vaccines, and if I don't know, you remember during this time was also the first Trump administration presidency, and he was also saying like we can use let's say products that are cleaning products to deal with the vaccine, but that was not the case. And I don't know if you remember, during this period, it was Dr. Fauci that was the one leading the US administration in the science part. But then Donald Trump, let's say there was tension between what Donald Trump was saying and what Dr. Fauci was saying, but he was the only one. But Donald Trump didn't want him there. So I wonder if you are in, because as Professor Gabi, she said that this is an ongoing process. So I wonder if you work in progress, you are also dealing with what is the role of international organizations, let's say WHO, what is the role of regional organization that in my case study with my colleague, we were doing this analysis of the measures taken by the member states, states party of the Convention of Human Rights, and what happened in the regional, let's say, regional context of the Convention of Human Rights and the courts. So the European Court of Human Rights didn't actually held accountable. So this is the question of transparency and accountability. The states that were taking, let's say, measures that were maybe undermining the human rights of the population, but also these kind of, I would say, disruptors of the trust of science. I would say not only Donald Trump, there were all other, let's say, leaders that were also in these similar positions. Thank you. I'm so sorry I took too much. Thank you.
Should I already?
Yeah, maybe we go one-on-one, right?
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much for your intervention. And I would like, if you have things that you can share with me, I would be very interested to know and having seen them. Now, as I said at the beginning, this is part of a wider project on scientific knowledge and policymaking, and such an issue cannot avoid, in its full, cannot avoid looking into the way that information on scientific knowledge is disseminated, and all this populist attack on science and the confusion. It was an enormous confusion. So you're right that this aspect is very important. I didn't treat it today because it could be too much, but it's definitely an important issue. What I see in the wider project, let's say, is how scientific knowledge gets into policy making, gets into public administration first and policy making then, but how in today's conditions it assumes a higher importance, but at the same time becomes much more vulnerable because it leaves the backstage. And by leaving the backstage, it opens a discussion on issues that practically anyone can say anything without evidence. This is why I also mentioned that the main challenge is that, I mean, one could say that my approach is elitist because scientific knowledge should not go out of the limited circles of those who are in the knowledge. But the risk is that by going out, then it is not scientific knowledge anymore. So it's a contradiction. It's a contradiction. We would start by saying that, yes, people should be aware. And that would be the first and most natural reflex to have. But then when you see what happens, once this debate opens, not on the policy measures, but on the scientific knowledge behind these measures, that can be interpreted in different ways, that can be prioritized in different ways, etc. But then the question, instead of criticizing policy options, they criticize scientific knowledge. And for me, this is an enormous risk because then science is treated as if it is just one voice among others and not the loudest even. So these are the current conditions we face, and this would mark a turn, a reversal in the way scientific knowledge gets into policy making and how we approach it, how we see it as positive, how we see it as something valuable. So coming to the question about the international regional organizations, I have to admit I didn't look specifically at this, but I use a generic term as expert bodies and experts because my focus is not on them, although they had and they have a big role to play. But I think that this discredit also affects them. If there is a mistrust, then it affects also these expert bodies. And I don't have answers. I just have concerns about this. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Mira. Over to your question.
Thank you. Thanks for your conversation just now as well. I was interested in what you were describing about the sort of the fomentation of conflict between two parties as a result of disagreements on science and science advice. And I wondered whether in the case of the vaccination policies, whether in your view and in your expertise, the level of backlash against vaccination policies would have been less if there had not been scientific figures advocating for it alongside the government? Or are there some issues that create this division irrespective of who is the mediator of that information? And then a connected question, and it was just something to open up your thoughts or reflection. I'm sure someone has studied some of these correlations, but I wonder whether scientific figures more easily represent a part of society and a way of being that for many people can feel unattainable or has felt also alienating for much of their lives. If you think of people who went through school feeling like they didn't belong there at all and they failed at school, failed at learning, failed at knowledge in quote unquote marks. where that figure starts to become something that indirectly quite easily makes people feel small or inadequate, not consciously. Whereas with politicians, now with certain politicians like Trump, having come to power, saying, at least in their narrative, you can come to power even if you did not, quote unquote, belong here. It creates a greater affinity or greater possibility for affinity from people than a scientific person would ever be able to create. And whether that's part of the cause of distrust and of that scientific figure actually undermining the buy-in from the population because they just feel alienated and pushed away.
Okay, can I?
Directly over to you, exactly.
Thank you very much. Also, no, the first question is a tricky one. If without this the support of highly visible scientists for vaccinations, we would have less reaction. I'm not sure. First of all, I just observe the facts. Vaccinations in the past, it was your local doctor who would say you have to get vaccines for your child or for yourself, or it was not a highly visible policy. It was through people, specialized people who were in a trust relationship with individual people. So the contestation of vaccinations is not completely new. It's older, but it has more recently taken, incredible dimensions at a very high risk, even for children, even more. So maybe scientific knowledge has to find different ways to approach people, not these highly visible, highly mediated, highly, I don't know, where the media play sometimes a negative role. It has to find other ways which are more reliable, in my view. I don't know how else I could reply to this question. Very legitimate. The other thing is that the second aspect is what you said about the reaction of people to scientists. It is a rather recent phenomenon that scientists are part of the elite, are seen as part of an elite which mistreats the people. And this is the rise in populism in various countries and with parties and non-directly politicized means also, social media, etc., where this kind of social inferiority that you mentioned is then used by politicians to portray themselves as the representatives of these people who is left behind, and therefore they are also against the elites, even if they do belong to the elites. I don't see Trump as being outside of an elite, but still they play this card by placing themselves as the representatives of such movements for political reasons. So, and political populism has a big, part in that, in what is happening. I don't know if we should start by trying to defend democracy against this political populism, or defend science vis-a-vis these anti-scientist and scientific movements. But there are two things that communicate. One fits the other. And the interesting thing is that it comes at a time when a lot has happened in the world, and I would say the Western world also, in terms of the economic crisis, globalization, with whatever that meant for certain parts of society who were, in many ways left behind. Then the economic crisis did something similar, and then we have, new crisis, health crisis, and this and that, and then all this wave of contestation has increased, and it's now much more of a problem than it was some decades ago. But definitely political populism and this feeling in society that they're left behind in some way, either in terms of education or in terms of financial capacity, etc. Yes, it's an enormous part in this.
Thanks a lot. Thanks. If no one else wants to come in, it gives me opportunity to point at two things, and I'm grouping my questions on two areas. The first very much links to the last point that you discussed on contestation of science and eroding trust in science, and the fact that I'm wondering if we're here not a bit in a rustling, rolling trap of factfulness, the book, to say we are seeing what is reported in the media. Obviously, contestation of science is a hotter topic to have in media reports than trust in science. And it seems that in a 2005 report, European Union, the survey period was from, I think, September 24 to 25. More than 80% of EU citizens said they trust science. They trust science and technology. Yet what we get reported is mistrust in science. And linking that to COVID, I don't know if you have this emotional memory still, but at the time, I exactly knew what an R factor was. I exactly knew what exponential knowledge in contagious rates was. We had a bigger literacy in the topic of policymaking because of the public engagement of science in policymaking. So, first thing, I'm wondering if this eroding trust in science is more of a media narrative, because, also the 3% climate denial academics and scientists who are just augmented by the media. And if you look, 97% agree on the human impact on climate change, while 3% not, but it seems in the reporting that there's a balanced disagreement. So that's one thing as a bit of a preliminary remark. I want to particularly focus on slides 9, 17, and 18, and 9, which links a bit to what you said, Calliope, with this. You are at times criticized for this a bit elitist perspective, which I think you're not having, but this relates to something you say on slide 9, which is that a forum of rational deliberation is missing on science advice and policymaking. And I'm wondering how this relates to the request. Well, yes, while this might be missing from a procedural point of view for the preciseness of interpretation of science, the opposite solution could be to increase literacy levels across the board, to increase literacy levels of citizens about uncertainty in science, about how science advice should be structured, could be structured, the benefit of science advice, but also literacy levels of academics, experts, scientists on politics. To understand, okay, I do have my randomized controlled trials, the results, if we think of evidence-based medicine, but the facts that I'm injecting here are injected in an environment and an ecosystem that needs to navigate interests, preferences, values. So the sheer information content of my piece of advice is filtered. And I'm wondering how this plea for a forum on rational deliberation of science advice relates to a general plea for increase of literacies, politics literacies, information literacies, across the board of society. So all citizens, no matter in which function. This is the first part, right? And this first part would lead to a question that I have in terms of visibility. So this brilliant conceptualization of visibility that you presented and the different impacts of aspects of visibility of science advice and expertise on politics. What does that mean in terms of institution building? How can we balance the two? So to have a even wiser person forum to discuss, contribute to a general increase in literacies on scientific advice, on the role of interests, values, preferences in politics, and on accountability and democratic governance. This is the first part of the question. The second part of the question would be trying to find out if this plays a role in your research, because I think it does actually in the diagnosis of the problem. So the diagnosis of the problem, what does visibility of expertise do for democratic governance? From my perspective, analyzes one part of the equation. Because the question to have a bit of a more holistic idea of visibility is the second one. How much of the diagnosis is owed to the imbalance of visibility, of expertise and interests? Oftentimes we say, oh, we see all of this science advice going in and then politicians decide differently. They are so stupid, they don't get it. Most of the politicians get it, but they have preferences, interests, and values. So an uptake of science advice in policymaking is impacted by both, right? So interests, values, and science advice. Accountability, the perception and transparency and the perception of that in democratic governance judges expertise stronger than interests. This expertise has failed to influence because interests are made less visible. So what if we zoom out and require visibility of interests and values in decision-making as well? So that citizens can judge, okay, a politician has taken up this science advice and the knowledge from research to a certain extent because their values, related maybe to religion, maybe to ethics, guide them in different dimensions. Could that be a way of increasing the status or the appreciation of science in policymaking? And if so, how could that indeed relate to procedural aspects? So conflict of interest disclaimers, something like that in policymaking. How can we balance the two? Because I think science advice is blamed in part for things that are related to other factors and variables of decision making in the public debate. Thank you.
Thank you, Gabi. I may come back to you for just to remember exactly if I'm not if I do not mistake your observations. And now, the first question was whether it is media narrative, okay, and or reality, and second, I calculated three. The second would be the forum of rational deliberation and literacy, and the third will come back to that. the other side of visibility. Okay, so regarding the first, it is definitely media narrative to a large extent, but the media have the capacity to propagate, to, because they take a small part and make it as if it's the whole. They have disproportional influence. And this is why I had to say something about the media. I felt I couldn't let it, even for reasons of, timing. I felt I had to say a few words about the role of the media.
Totally important. Absolutely.
Yeah, because everything goes through the media, more or less. Okay, I mean, very few people may read the government announcements or announcements by expert international organizations, but they will definitely hear or see something in the news or in the social media, whatever that does, I mean, transfers as knowledge. So yes, it is partly media narrative, but it is not as marginal. Why? Because it has become official policy. Trump, with his chlorine, or I don't know what kind of detergent he wanted us to swallow, and others. And in other cases, we have an official mistrust. So we cannot just say it's the media. It takes proportions that are beyond the media. The media continue to propagate that, especially when they are controlled by these politicians. So we have a mixture of a political issue and kind of scientific issue, a political issue of how politicians and certain political parties treat scientific knowledge. And then we have scientific knowledge, which from the other side is offering sometimes itself to such a misuse. Because, for example, the contestation of climate change, there have been scientists who played that card, and they gained in recognition or in publicity for some time. There's a book about that, how in fact certain scientists tried to support the tobacco industry in saying that tobacco has no negative implications. So it's not new. It started with tobacco. It has taken large proportions with climate change and with the vaccines. So yes, the media play a big and very sometimes negative role, but we cannot throw away the media. We have politicians who take up these positions and make them official positions, official policy. You can see Kennedy with vaccines in the US. And we cannot really dismiss it as something that is a non-problem. It is a problem.
Yeah. Can I just quickly jump in there for your ongoing research project? I think it would be extremely valuable to integrate a reflection on established academic consensus versus the medialization of dissent, and how this distorts the perception of academic consensus. So in climate change, usually you have the 79% and the 3%. The 3% in media are treated as if they were 50-50. And from there comes the perception, oh, it's not that clear. The same goes for, as an example, the American administration, Trump during COVID. I think it's valuable to look into whether misinformation becomes part of official policies or of an official government narrative. And I think in the case of the US administration, it was rather the second, because the president issued that over and over again. And we remember still Fauci in the backdrop of the press conferences and his faces that he tried not to make. So that I think there's a difference in between an official government narrative and official policies. So for the project, it would be interesting to look into that. Sorry.
Yeah. Yes, you're right. I mean, what concerns me is that these anti-science positions are becoming official, even official narrative.
Totally. And therefore powerful.
I mean, sometimes, yes, and sometimes narrative is stronger than policy.
Totally.
It's the way people perceive it more
Because it
than
impacts
what is
behavior.
really done. Yeah. So definitely this is an interesting aspect. Let me now go to the second sub-question about the forum of rational deliberation. And it also refers to the first part, because when scientific knowledge is uncertain or is relatively path-breaking, or but still valuable, it is very difficult for outsiders to understand the part of uncertainty, the role of uncertainty, the fact that scientists talk in terms of percentage, chances, it's an assessment, because people like policymakers need certainty. They look for certainty. And when they don't see certainty, they think that what is said it's not worth even considering. So this aspect is very important in climate change, and it was very important also during COVID, because there was uncertainty. And the consensus of the scientists, maybe it is, I mean, now it can be 97-3, but in the past it was less. Huh? So it's a dynamic process. And when there is such uncertainty, it is very difficult to have a rational deliberation with those who do not share the basics of how scientific knowledge is produced and what it means. It's difficult to understand that there is always a risk. Even the best medicine has loads of counterindications and potential risks. So among specialists, such a discussion can take place more easily, because they can check each other's assumptions, why they say that and on what evidence, etc. That's why I say there is no forum of rational deliberation. If that can be achieved through better or higher literacy, scientific literacy, throughout society, I think this is a way to do it. I don't know how easy it is to, or how much we can succeed in that. It is difficult. Also for psychological reasons, because of this need for certainty. The need for certainty from the side of people who are not familiar with science means that whenever they see uncertainty, they tend to contest it, to say, oh, it's not worth it. They don't know what they're talking about. But in any case, if there is something we can do, yes, increase media literacy, scientific literacy is a way. There is no magic solution anyway. And I think it's the third one is about the visibility and yes, policy preferences, interests, and values. Of course, politics is, first of all, policy preferences, interests, and values. But then, in the context we are discussing of this kind of populist approach, all this is a source of conspiracy theories. Again, the problem and my concern is that we lose our stable points of reference. And science used to be, for a lot of time, it used to be the stable point of reference, maybe even too much, but it was a stable point of reference. Politics is not a stable point of reference because politics is always suspected for something happening behind the scenes. Interests and secret interests who guide, policy decisions. And the problem is that because politics are seen as suspicious, this suspicion is transferred to science. So explain to people that, yes, policies are not just scientific data. It's also assessment. It's also assessment of contradictory objectives. We need the economy to function, but we also need to not to propagate the pandemic, the illness. So all of that, I think it is quite difficult to make people think about it without falling into this trap of a continuous suspicion. Yeah, there are always substitutes, little ways to deal with it, like the literacy we talked about. You can also talk about conflict of interest, or it's the same with the scientists who go out and do it for they may not even believe in what they are saying, but they do it because it promotes their career or it makes their name known or whatever. You can't know what are the reasons behind such behavior. The fact is that this behavior is here. So there are little things we can do. I just doubt that it's easy to reverse this situation. If I find a better answer to your question, I'll come back.
I mean, that's part of the research project, right? And sorry for me being a bit absent-minded because I was searching for a report that exactly deals in a good way, I think, with this element of uncertainty. So the sixth IPCC synthesis report did really this behind nearly, and I have put the URL into the chat if someone is interested. Nearly behind every claim in the text is with high confidence, low confidence, and they don't talk about certainty anymore. So this is about science communication, right? With high confidence, we say ABC. With medium confidence, we say CDD. So that's part of the equation where we think, or where one could think that it might, and the IPC is also an example for what you propose as this forum of rational reflection. IPCC functions not with original research, but with research synthesis. So they look into what has been published and what is the synthesized outcome of it. So they look more into the consensus of science, the established consensus of science, and link that to confidence, recommendations that they can confidently make, claims that they can confidently make as a big group, over 1,000 academics and scientists. I think these are groups that are very well established and that could be examples for national, equivalent national knowledge broker nodes. But I think that what is interesting to see in your research is how this links to the demand side. So how citizens are really literate to understand what is going on in science, and how science lives on uncertainty, while politics dies on uncertainty, right? If you want to put it bluntly. So how the logics of the system impact on instrumentalization of visibility, as you really, really brilliantly showed in your conceptualizations of what does visibility indeed mean, and how this can be mitigated to increase both the impact of science in politics and for societies and the understanding of every citizen, not only functional citizens like policymakers, but every citizens for the relevance of an established consensus on the factual basis of politics. Do you have a timeline in your project work?
That's the most difficult question of the day.
Best for last.
Yes, hopefully coming months. I mean, this part on visibility is more or less, finished.
Mm-hmm.
The rest, it's quite advanced. I want to continue looking into the populism aspect.
Yeah.
Which is, I think in terms of policy making and public administration, it's relatively new still. I mean, populism was an object for, political science pure. The aspect
party
of
politics.
policy and public administration is marginal. As I would like to look at it because it links to that. I don't work on populism as such, but some elements have to be into because there is also whole discussion about the so-called populist epistemology and all of that, which relates to what we said about the promotion of this kind of way of thinking. So we can talk about that later.
So if there's anything you want to discuss at any time, let us know.
Okay.
Yeah, and also bilaterally, if you want a sounding board or what have you. In the meantime, let us know. It was really, really great to have this sneak peek into your research.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for also the discussion because it's something that mobilizes you, and also you think of things that you may not have seen before.
Yeah,
it's very useful.
Perfect. Thank you very much. That's great. That's great. That's great, everyone. And I'm just doing a sneak peek into a table that I have open and now need to find. Here we go. We can meet each other again on 29th of April, if you're interested, from 1:30 to 3. Marta Cantero Gamito will talk about harmonizing consensus, the geopolitical economy of standardization in the AI Act. So, and now for something completely different, but still related to expertise. If you're interested, join us then. And Calliope, again, thank you very much. And please come back to us when you want to discuss other things and join all the other events that we will have. Warmly invited. Yeah,
Really.
Thank you very much. Thanks.